have free online quiz makers, which is okay. There are limitations, so I'd have to purchase an account, which is not a big deal. So that's an option that I might do is there's this thing called Flexi Quiz that I might just put the quiz online, and then I'd send you the link, and then you'd go on there, take the quiz, it would give the results, and then I would manually enter your results into Canvas, and you can also see your results for a fee. But, well, I got to make some money, you know. I'm a poor man, Mr. Malone. I need to make my bones, you know?
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I would not charge you for your results. But so you'd be able to see your results, and I would manually enter them. So that's the update on that. Okay. Sister Thea Bowman, who is servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman. So she's at the lowest level of in the process for going to sainthood. She was declared a servant of God in 2018. Who is she? She was born Bertha Elizabeth Bowman. She was born in 1937 and died in 1990. 1937 and died in 1990. As you can see from the picture, she was a nun, obviously a black nun, black Catholic. I'm focusing on, whoops, I forgot I have no pocket. I'm focusing on people who are on their path to sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church, Americans who are, I should say, American blacks who are on their way to sainthood. She was not born into a Catholic family. She was not raised Catholic. She was raised Methodist Christian. But at a very early age, at the age of 9, she came to the decision that she wanted to be a Roman Catholic, and with the permission of her parents, she was able to convert, to switch over to the Roman Catholic Church. And also at an early age, in her teenage years, she decided she wanted to be a nun. And so she joined the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. So I guess this is an order of sisters based on the tradition of this man called St. Francis of Assisi from the Middle Ages, very holy man, and perpetual adoration. So one of their charisms, their characteristics, their special things that they do was to adore the Jesus present in the bread and the wine and the Blessed Sacrament all the time. Is hopefully, if they had enough sisters, they would do it 24 hours a day. These days, who knows what they do, because there are not that many sisters out there. The numbers have cratered over the last 50 years, but nevertheless, that was their charism, their gift. So she joined them. She got a PhD in English literature from the Catholic University of America. Very smart woman, dedicated. And speaking of dedicated, she dedicated herself to the black experience in the American Catholic Church. She was instrumental in compiling a black hymnal, a hymnal of black Catholic hymns. I should mention that she was the only black nun, black sister in her religious order that she joined, which tells you something about the history or the experience of black Catholics in the American Church. So anyways, she eventually got cancer and died from cancer. And as I told you, in 2018, her cause for sainthood was opened. And then in 2018, she was designated a servant of God. So it's still early days for her cause. Who knows when she'll be declared venerable, etc., and so forth. Let's hope so. So I ask servant of God Thea Bowman to bless us with her prayers and pray for the salvation of our souls. Amen. Mr. Grimaldi. Hello, sir. Mr. Grimaldi. I feel like I'm missing something, but I don't know what. Anyways. PowerPoint here. And where did we stop? The Jews. We talked about this. Did we talk about this? Yes, I think. Paul of Tarsus, the Testimonium Flavianum, the Gospels, and here we are with this. Okay. Okay, so to repeat what I said last time, the Gospels, the four holy Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though they are religious documents, but that doesn't mean they don't include historical memories, and they are still some of our best resources, historical resources for the life and the teachings, or I should say the ministry and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So, well, anyway, not so. And so where do they start? Hopefully you've read the Gospel of Mark and also the readings from the Gospel of Matthew. Well, the Gospels start at the beginning. We do have stories of the birth of Jesus. If you read the Gospel of Mark, you know it doesn't have any birth story. It just jumps right in with the ministry of Jesus when he was in his 30s or maybe late 20s. But the Gospels of Matthew and Luke do provide what are called infancy narratives. It's just a fancy way of saying stories about the birth of Jesus, with which do have some information about his early life. Some information. Not a lot, but some. So there you have a definition of what an infancy narrative is. Okay? The different traditions about the birth and boyhood of Jesus. And if you read the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, they're very different. They're clearly not dependent on each other. The stories given in the Gospel of Matthew and the stories that are found in Luke are independent resources. We don't know where they got them from or if they're their own stories, but they're not based on each other because they're so different. They don't tell the same story, but they do repeat some of the same information. They tell us that Jesus had a father and a mother. We know his father, so it was believed, was a man named Joseph. Again, Yosef, a common Jewish name, nothing unusual about that. The word Joseph or Yosef in Hebrew means God will increase, as in to add to something. And then he had a mother named Miriam in Hebrew, Mary, as it's transliterated into Greek and Latin, Miriam, which means rebellious or bitterness. Mara, which is interesting. You expect it to have a more, more positive connotation, but it doesn't. There's nothing you can do about it. It comes from the Greek Hebrew word Mara, which means rebellious or bitterness, which might be something. There might be some kind of symbolic nature to that name in the sense that Mary was not rebellious. She accepted the will of God in her life. But I'm theologizing. The name means what it means. It's no mark on the person of Mary or Miriam, his mother. So he had a mother and a father, and we know their names traditionally given. I'm going to assume that these were actually their names. And the infancy narratives begin with the story of what's called the virgin birth. The virgin birth, let me tell you, put this on the PowerPoint. No, I did not, but I'll tell you, it is not the Immaculate Conception. People get this wrong all the time, not just Catholics and Christians. But I would assume people who are not Christian would get this wrong, make this little mistake, but you have even Catholics make this mistake. The Immaculate Conception applies to Mary herself. The belief in the Immaculate Conception, as we will learn later when we have a class and we talk about Mary and the saints, it applies to the fact that when Mary was conceived in her mother's womb, Saint Anne or Hannah, she was preserved from the state of original sin. So she was born free from sin. She was without defect. Immacula. Macula is a defect in Latin, a wound. Okay? She was preserved without defect, the defect of sin. So she was conceived without sin, the Immaculate Conception. That applies to Mary. Does not apply to Jesus. The virgin birth is about Jesus. It's the belief that Jesus was born without the normal, natural aid of sexual intercourse, that his mother did not have sex ever, apparently, because she was a virgin. Certainly she was a virgin at his birth. That's at least that's the story. And this is a detail, even though when they talk about this idea of the virgin birth, even though Matthew and Luke have completely different stories, in Matthew's story, Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant, and he knows he's not the father. Problem. She's married to Joseph, but she's pregnant, and Joseph knows he hasn't been with her yet. He hasn't even had sex with her yet. They're just newly married. So this is an issue. What to do about it? Does he expose her to the law of Moses, which might include her being stoned to death? Joseph kind of doesn't want to do that. He leans towards just quietly divorcing her and not shaming her in the community, just divorcing, breaking the marriage, and moving on. But he receives a dream where God kind of reveals to him that no, this is not a natural. She did not she was not unfaithful to you. She did not have sex with another man. This was a supernatural event. Where she conceived Christ or conceived Jesus. And so Joseph accepts this dream, the message of this dream, and takes her as his wife anyways. Okay, this is enough for him. In the story of Luke, an angel goes to Mary. I mean, Joseph isn't even really part of the story in the Gospel of Luke. An angel appears to Mary and says, hey, you're going to be the mother of the Messiah. So you're going to be pregnant. Mary's kind of puzzled by this because she's like, well, I haven't had sex yet, and I haven't. How is this going to happen if I don't know man, which is a Hebrew expression to know someone is a kind of a euphemism for having sex with them, to get to know them, I guess you could say. So she's puzzled by how this is going to happen, and the angel's like, don't worry about this. This will be the work of God. You will be, the conception of Jesus in your womb, or this figure in your womb will happen as kind of miraculously, supernaturally. And she says, okay, and the story moves on. So there are two different stories, but they all agree on the one thing, that there was a belief that there was something that was supernatural about the origins of Jesus of Nazareth, that his mother did not conceive him by the usual means, sexual activity, either with somebody else who was not her husband, but not by Joseph either, her husband. So that came about that way. So there is agreement on that fact. Whether you believe in virgin births or not is beside the point. The fact is that they do agree on the fact that there was something unusual about the origins of Jesus. He was not born in the normal or conceived in the normal way. What other facts do we get from the infancy narratives? Well, Matthew and Luke both agree in their stories, even though they're very different, that Jesus was born during the reign of this man called King Herod, who reigned over Judea from 37 BC until 4 BC. Okay, this is the region, look on the map, this is the region of Judea. This is how, at the time of Jesus, in the first century AD, how the Romans kind of divided up this area, which they called Palestine. The Romans called it Palestine. So you had Judea here, you had Samaria, you had Galilee, other places like the Decapolis, the places, 10 cities, etc., and so forth. But this region, called Judea, where Jerusalem was under the rule of a king of the Jews, named Herod, sometimes called Herod the Great. And he was king, as I said, from 37 to 4 BC. Did I write that? I did not put that on the PowerPoint. 37 to 4. To 4 BC. So that gives us some kind of reference. He is an historical figure. We know he existed. Historians know he existed. So that gives us some kind of timeline when around abouts Jesus was born. And from the story, mostly based on the Gospel of Matthew, that's how scholars date Jesus' birth to around 6 BC. So it's a couple of years or several years before the death of Herod in 4 BC that Jesus was born, and we know this by some details in the Gospel of Matthew, which I'm not going to get into the nuts and the bolts of that. I'm just telling you. Luke, though, is writing, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the Gospels, when we're going to talk about the Bible more in depth. Luke adds more historical information. Luke is more of an historian. Out of all the 4 Gospels, Luke is the most consciously historical of them. He says that he's taken the stories that he's heard from different people. He's looked at different narratives on the life of Jesus. We don't have these narratives anymore, so we don't know what he was looking at. But he's taken this information, he's tried to compile it into his gospel, with the best information that he has about Jesus. And so he consciously adds historical references. It doesn't mean he's always the most historical. And ironically enough, John, which if you read the Gospel of John, is very, very different from the other Gospels. John actually contains a lot more historical detail than Luke does, but Luke is the more consciously historical from his point of view, we could say. And Luke adds more historical information. He adds who was the Roman emperor at the time, not just the Jewish king of Judea, but he tells us that Caesar Augustus was the emperor at the time. He also tells us who was the Roman governor of the province of Syria here in the north. And the province of Syria had direct control over all these southern regions, including Judea. Okay, so even though Herod was technically king of Judea, the ruler of Judea, had a lot of power, he answered to whoever was the governor of Syria and was put into place by the Romans, of course the governor of Syria answered to the emperor of Rome. So Luke adds those details for us, which is helpful. It's helpful, but it's also not helpful, because the Caesar Augustus was also known by the name Octavian. I wrote down his dates here. Did I write down his dates? Oh, I should have written down his dates. Can I remember his dates? Well, I'll talk about, 27 to 14 BC to 14 AD. Caesar Augustus reigned from 27 BC until 14 AD. So that coincides with Herod, as you can see. Okay, so they're both reigning at the same time. But then Luke adds this information that this man Quirinius was governor of Syria. And here's where a problem enters in, because we know when Quirinius was governor of Syria, his full name was Publius Sulpicius Quirinius, in case you're wondering. Sulpicius Q. Quirinius, see Quirinius right there, and he was governor of Syria, of the province of Syria, from 6 to 7 AD. Which poses an historical problem, because that does not overlap. Herod was long dead by the time Quirinius was governor. It does overlap with Caesar Augustus, so there's no problem there. But it does create kind of an historical problem that people have tried to resolve for a long, long, long time. Don't try to resolve it yourself, because you'll drive yourself mad trying to do it. There doesn't seem to be... There is a conflict in the dates. So what's going on here with Luke? Probably Luke was trying to be close enough in his dating. I mean, you have to understand what you're dealing with. This is the ancient world. It's not like today where you can get more accurate information. You have access to the internet, so you can get more accurate information on when things occurred. This is the ancient world where you have to rely a lot on your memory when you think people reigned, or where they were, or what they were doing. Maybe you have some official records that you can refer to, but maybe not. We have very few official records from the ancient world, especially the Roman Empire, so who knows what Luke had access to. I'd say he was probably relying on his memory, and he remembered that, yep, there was Herod, there was Octavian was the emperor, and oh yeah, Quirinius was governor, and he's off. He's off. He's trying to be close enough in his dating. Both of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, agree that Jesus was born in this town of Bethlehem, which is in the southern part of Palestine. Bethlehem, you see down here on the map, which is in Judea. All right. However, he's called Jesus of Nazareth. He's always called Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus is never called Jesus of Bethlehem. Okay, if you remember, people didn't have last names. They were known by their family, like who their father was, Jesus, son of Joseph. It's called that. You're known by your trade, Jesus the carpenter. Jesus is called that in the Gospels. And you're known by where you came from. Jesus the Nazarene, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus is most often called that. Well, Nazareth is all the way up here in the province of Galilee, which was ruled by another person, not by Herod, nor by the Romans, and another ruler. It's an interesting detail. How did Jesus get born in Bethlehem? We don't know. But that is seems to be an historical memory that was preserved by the church, that Jesus was born actually in Bethlehem, even though he grew up and was known as coming from Nazareth of Galilee. And we see this kind of confusion, acceptance of the tradition, but also this confusion in the Gospels, because in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, okay? And then later, his family travels up from Bethlehem to live in Nazareth. So that explains how he got to Nazareth. That's why he's Jesus the Nazarene and not Jesus the Bethlehemite or something. Luke, however, has Jesus and Mary and Joseph already living in Nazareth. And they had to travel down to Bethlehem for Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. So, there's a little bit of a confusion about how Jesus got to Nazareth and how he got to Bethlehem that you see in the Gospels. And again, don't try to figure it out because scholars have tried and you'll go crazy trying to do it. But what we do have here are two separate traditions that somehow Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. And how that happened, we don't know. We have two different explanations, one according to the Gospel of Matthew, one according to the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is described as a carpenter in the earliest of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark. Here we are. Jesus is called a tectone, which is generally translated as a carpenter, but it's a handyman, a tradesman, someone who works with his hands, which could be a carpenter. Carpenter is not a bad translation. It's just, the word tectone can have a broader meaning than just a carpenter. It's generally someone who works with his hands. We have this word in the word architect. All right, architect, tect from tectone, someone who works with his hands or her hands, creating foundations like buildings and stuff like that, an architect. So Jesus worked with his hands. Where am I here? It's not on the PowerPoint. That is on the PowerPoint, I think. Let me just check something here. There we go. It's an interesting detail that Jesus was a carpenter, and so was his father. Joseph is described as a carpenter. That they were skilled tradesmen is an interesting detail because according to the Oxford Dictionary of the Bible, carpenters were of a lower class. So it tells us something about the social situation of Joseph, Jesus' father, and Jesus himself. That to be a carpenter, you're considered of the lower classes. You are not as bad as a beggar, which tells you something, but you were not better than, say, a small landowner, a peasant, someone who had a little piece of land that they would farm for their own food and stuff like that. So that tells you something about where Jesus fit in the whole social stratum of first century Palestine. I'm going to come to that in a second. I told you that both Matthew and Luke agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which is in central Israel, but he apparently grew up in Nazareth in the Galilee. The Galilee was a very mixed society. There were Jews in Galilee, but there are also a lot of non-Jews in Galilee. Okay, which again tells you something about the social situation of Jesus, that he was around Jews, but there are also a lot of non-Jews that he one would assume that he must have known or interacted with. There was not a lot of respect for Galileans, from what we can tell. Galilee was kind of like the backwater. Galileans were considered uncouth or crude, kind of like country bumpkins. rednecks, one might say, by those who were living in the south, in Judea, around the big city of Jerusalem. Okay, there were no big cities in Galilee. It's like the countryside. So that again tells you something about Jesus and how he might have been viewed. When people listen to this guy, like, where's this guy from? Galilee, And we kind of see this in the Gospels, especially, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, when people are questioning if Jesus is the Messiah figure, this King Savior. Some people raise the objection, yeah, but the Messiah doesn't come from Galilee. Galilee? And even one of Jesus' apostles, when he first meets Jesus, he hears that Jesus is from Nazareth in Galilee. And this apostle said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? He insults Jesus. He doesn't have a high opinion of Jesus until he meets Jesus and changes his mind. So we kind of see that attitude being played out in the Gospels to some extent. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about the backstory of the Gospels. I mentioned Herod and I mentioned Octavian. I just want to say one or two things about them because they do connect up with the Gospels and what's going on there. I told you that Herod is sometimes called the Great for his accomplishments, especially his accomplishments in construction projects. He was known for that. And some of these construction projects were quite cutting edge. For example, he built a port on the seaside of Palestine using underwater cement, apparently cement that could harden underwater, which was really an interesting innovation for first century AD construction techniques. So he was known as the Great. In 37 BC, the year 37 BC, I did, okay. In the year 37 BC, he was installed by the Romans as the King of the Jews, the Rex Judeorum. And as I told you, he reigned from 37 to 4 BC. Up above, you can see his actual dates when he lived. He lived from 73 or 74 until 4 BC. And you can see his name in Hebrew was Hordos and in Greek was Herodes. This is interesting, very interesting, because first, who else is called King of the Jews? Have you heard of somebody else, Miss Civarelli, who's been called King of the Jews? Yeah. And let's check over here. Let's see. My eyeglasses. Yes, so if you look on a crucifix, they traditionally have this piece of writing over the head of Jesus. And this is historically true. The Romans would place the title of the charge of the criminal over the criminal's head. So, this is Marcus, a thief, and it kind of tells you who he is and why he's being crucified, he's being executed. For Jesus, the charge was Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, or Jesus, King of the Jews, which kind of tells you, he was a political, maybe an insurrectionist or a revolutionary, or certainly someone challenging the rule of the Roman emperor. So he was being executed for that. And you'll see INRI on most Catholic crucifixes. This is in Latin, because Catholics used to speak Latin a lot. So, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum is what it means. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Okay? INRI. So, it tells you something. Who else is called King of the Jews? Jesus in the Gospels. Who else is called King of the Jews? King Herod. He was given the official title by the Romans. That was his status. So there could be kind of a polemic going on here, kind of a conflict going on here between the Christians and Herod, in the Gospels. You're not the true King of the Jews, Herod. Jesus is the King of the Jews. There's an opposition here between Herod and Jesus, even from Jesus' birth. Because Herod wants to kill Jesus when he hears a prophecy or hears a story that the Messiah has been born in Bethlehem. Further interesting about Herod, a further interesting detail about Herod being called King of the Jews is the fact that there is a significant question whether this man was even a Jew, ethnically a Jew. Religiously, yes, he seemed to observe the Jewish religion. He was a Jew by religion, but he does not seem to have been ethnically a Jew. His father was an Idumean, who, if we look at our map of the region, you see down here Idumea, so this region, who did convert to Judaism. They were forced to convert to Judaism at a certain time in history, but his father was not ethnically of the Jewish people. They were converts. But see, that's not so much a problem as his mother's origins, okay? Because Jews traditionally do not trace the origins of your Jewishness through the father. It's matrilineal. It's your mother has to be a Jew for you to be considered 100% Jewish. And his mother certainly was not. His mother was a Nabatean, and the Nabateans came from this region, over here in the eastern part of Palestine. And so she apparently was not Jewish at all. The Nabateans were known to be traders. Not traders as in like betrayers. I mean traders, like they traded goods. They went around with their camels with goods and stuff, and they went to places and they sold them and traded goods. Okay, that was their function, or that was what they were known as. So maybe at best Herod was a half Jew. So this was something of an insult to the local population that the Romans would install this half Jew. Okay. As their king, the king of the Jews. So Herod was deeply hated by the Jewish population. He was considered a traitor because he was so kind of cozy and close with the Roman occupiers. He was considered a collaborator and a sellout. And after Herod dies in 4 BC, this doesn't, I didn't want to go back to the map. Herod kind of sticks around through his sons. Herod is dead, King Herod is dead, but his sons control other regions. For example, his son, he's kind of like, you ever hear of the boxer George Foreman? Who named all his kids George. They're all George, every kid. I don't know how he calls any of them, because he said, "Hey, George, what are you doing? George, come here." Which one of his kids knows which to come to him, Well, Herod kind of did the same thing. All of his sons have the name Herod, or I should say most of his sons have the name Herod. So up here we had Herod Antipas, we had Herod Philip, ruling these two regions. Okay, so for our purposes, we're interested in Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee during the time of Jesus, and apparently has interactions with Jesus and stuff like that, has some sort of respect for Jesus or curiosity about who Jesus is. But anyways, so Herod's legacy continues on throughout the Gospels. So you should know that in the story, when you're reading the Gospels, like in the Gospel of Mark, which has no infancy narrative, so it never mentions King Herod, who is dead. But it does mention Herod, and it's talking about Herod Antipas. Okay, and Mark never says Antipas, he says Herod. So you can be kind of confusing, but just so you know that it's Herod Antipas he's referring to. And then when he's referring to Herod Philip, I think he just calls him Philip. I don't think he or he might call him Herod as well. But anyways. The other person that is mentioned is Octavian, Caesar Augustus. You can see, again, when he reigned 27 BC to 14 AD. I put down when he lived. I did not, so I don't have his dates for life. Obviously, he died in 14 AD. I don't know when he was born. And he took the name of Caesar Augustus, and after Caesar from Julius Caesar, who I forget what his relationship with Julius Caesar was. I forget if Julius Caesar was his uncle or his adoptive father, something like that. But there was a relationship there. So out of respect to Julius Caesar, whom he considered a god, he took the name of Caesar and added the word Augustus. The word Augustus in Latin means venerable or honorable. So he was the honored Caesar. So he's kind of continuing in the line of Julius Caesar. And interestingly enough, he called himself the Son of God. We see this here, for example, on this coin from the period, which shows a picture, an imprint of the head of Augustus. Kind of see this here if you look, Augustus. And right here you have the phrase Divi Filius, F, which is abbreviated for Filius. So there you have it right there. He called himself the Son of God. Who else is called the Son of God, I wonder? I think I've heard that before from some religious figure in history, you know? His accession to power as the emperor began the period of the Roman Empire proper. Okay, historians really date the period of the Roman Empire to the time of Octavian or Caesar Augustus. And by Roman Empire, I mean that Rome's rule over the known world in the West. The known world, which is around the Mediterranean Sea, parts of modern-day France. I don't think they made it into Germany yet, but anyways, so the whole Mediterranean basin area was controlled and dominated by the Romans. And the beginning of his reign was considered to be a beginning an era of peace and prosperity, what they called either the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, or more specifically, the Augustan peace. The peace of Octavian, the Pax Augusta. It was a time of order where the Romans were bringing order to all of society throughout the Mediterranean world, and that was seen as a good thing. So when you read, you read in the Gospel of Luke, the story of Jesus' birth, and you hear this during Christmas time, and as Jesus is born in a stable in Bethlehem, a bunch of shepherds are nearby, and they receive a revelation from angels, and these angels appear and tell them the Christ, the Messiah, the King Savior has been born in Bethlehem, go see him. And then they all start breaking out into song and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to all people of goodwill." This echoes statements from the Pax Augusta, peace on earth throughout all earth. And this is kind of how the Roman emperor at the time spoke like this, wishing people peace throughout the earth because of the Roman emperor. So scholars see here kind of a little bit of a dig that's going on between Luke and the reigning Roman Empire to say, no, we have the true Son of God, the Messiah of the Jews, who has brought true peace to all the earth. You Romans haven't really brought peace. You've brought it through the force of arms, through your armies, by conquering people. But here is this baby born in a stable who is the true King of Peace. Okay, almost nothing is known, apart from Jesus' birth, almost nothing is known about Jesus' youth or early adulthood. There is one brief story in the Gospel of Luke about Jesus as a young boy, maybe around 12 or 13, but that's all we have, okay? The Gospels basically skip ahead, at least in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, skip ahead from the birth of Jesus to his ministry. And so that's what we'll do here. As you know, if you've read the Gospel of Mark doesn't even have an infancy narrative, just begins with the ministry of Jesus. Actually, not even the ministry of Jesus. It begins with another person, John the Baptist. And the same happens with the Gospel of John. It opens with some opening introductory material, but then it starts with the John the Baptist out in the desert. So now we come to Jesus' ministry. And we see here what the word means. The word ministro in Latin very simply means to serve or to provide a service. And that's what a ministry is. It's the providing of a service. Okay? And when you think about the Gospels, all the Gospels follow, in telling the ministry of Jesus, they all follow the same pattern. You can see the same pattern in all four Gospels. So scholars kind of wonder, was there already a structure given to Jesus' ministry by Christians early on? And we see this in the four Gospels, because we have four different writers who are imitating the same pattern. the same basic outline. And what do we see? Jesus' ministry starts, or the story of his ministry starts with the baptism ministry of a man called St. John the Baptist, St. John the Baptizer. It then follows with Jesus' ministry of teaching, healing, possibly also baptizing people himself, exorcising or casting out demons or devils. After that, we have what's called the Passion narrative. The Passion narrative, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And after we have the Passion narrative, we have stories of the empty tomb. That Jesus who was killed, the Jesus was killed on the cross, but his body is not found in the tomb several days later. And by saying the empty tomb, that includes also post-resurrectional appearances, okay? Mark seems to have, the Gospel of Mark seems to have just ended with the story of the empty tomb. And then a longer ending was added on later where Jesus appears to the apostles. But it seems pretty evident from the Greek text, the way he wrote his gospel, that Mark just ends with Jesus the crucified has risen. Look in the tomb, there's no body there anymore. You can't find him because he has been raised from the dead. And that's where the gospels seem to have ended. And then later on, stories are added. But in the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, you have the empty tomb, but you also have all sorts of post-resurrectional appearances, stories about Jesus appearing to his followers after the empty tomb to show that he was alive again. All right, most of that is self-explanatory, but I just want to talk about the Passion narrative. What is passion? The Passion narrative. The word passion comes from a Latin word patior, which means to suffer. So it is the story of Jesus' suffering and death, the Passion narrative. I didn't put that on there. Okay, that's fine. Just so you know. And each of the Gospels has their own version of the Passion narrative. Okay, so that's the structure of Jesus' ministry. It begins with John the Baptist, then it moves into the longer section talking about what Jesus did during his own ministry. It ends with the story of Jesus' crucifixion, his death on the cross, and then finally his raising from the dead. And that's the basic story. And you see this outline in all of them. Jesus' ministry is characterized by words and deeds, which should be no surprise. People talk and people do stuff. Nothing unique about the story of Jesus with the fact that Jesus spoke and that he did things. We find this in all sorts of religions, but all religions, But for our purposes, Jesus' ministry is characterized by his teaching, his words, specifically his teaching, and his deeds, specifically his miracles, but especially the ultimate deeds that Jesus accomplished, which are his death on the cross and his resurrection or rising from the dead. Again, Luke, who is the more historical or more consciously historical of the Gospels, is the only one to give us the detail about when Jesus began his ministry. Luke tells us that Jesus began his ministry around the age of 30, when he was 30 years old, which could mean he was 28, Mr. Kozlowski, but it could also mean he was 32. It's around the age of 30. And he also tells us that Jesus began his ministry during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. And when did Tiberius reign? Well, Tiberius succeeded Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, and he reigned from 14 AD until 37 AD. Until 37. So that gives us he tells us that Jesus started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius's reign. So if you add these up, you get to the year 29 AD. Okay. So that gives us a rough estimate of around the year that Jesus started his ministry. So around 28 or 29, Jesus apparently started his ministry. And I'm just going to go through it in the structure, following the basic outline as the Gospels do, which starts with this man, John the Baptist, baptizing Jesus. Okay, out in the desert or the wilderness, you have this man called John. He's a religious figure. He's called John the Baptizer. The word baptize comes from a Greek word baptizo, which Mr. Grimaldi simply means to dunk in water. That's all it means. You dunk something in water. It doesn't have to be a person, could be a thing, whatever. It's a simple meaning. So literally his name is John the Dunker. John the Dunker. Or John the Baptizer. So John the Baptizer arrives preaching in the desert and dunking people in water. This is unusual. This actually is unusual. Did Jews have purifications in water, dunking in water and stuff? Yes, you did. They did. But you did it yourself. You dunked yourself in water for purification from ritual uncleanness and stuff like that. It was very unusual for another person to dunk you in water. So this was notable. Hence his name, John the Dunker, John the Baptizer. That's why he's called John the Baptizer and not just John. All right, what he was doing was unusual. People were coming to him, and he was dunking them in water for the forgiveness of their sins. He is considered a prophetic figure. He was considered a prophet. Maybe the Messiah, some people thought, but generally he's conceived, at least from the Christian perspective and the perspective of the Gospels, as a prophet, a person who speaks on behalf of God. And John has started his own renewal movement within Judaism, where the purpose of his baptism, as I already told you, is for the forgiveness of sins, but he's preaching a message of conversion. He wants Jews to change their lifestyle. And so he goes out baptizing, dunking people in water. Now, Jesus appears with John. Jesus just shows up, and Jesus, too, is baptized by John. Does that mean Jesus had sins to be forgiven? Jesus needed conversion? That's an interesting question. And the Gospels kind of have to address this. Like in the Gospels we find in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, there's this back and forth dialogue between Jesus and John, where John's like, no, I have to be baptized by you, like Jesus is the superior. And Jesus is just like, well, we need to fulfill all righteousness, which is another way of saying we need to fulfill God's will, so just do it, But it shows you that for the early Christian community, this was a question mark. They had to answer this question of why would Jesus need to be dunked by John if Jesus himself is the Messiah, even more than the Messiah? But the fact that this was a question probably attests to the fact that the baptism of Jesus by John or his association with John is historical. It's probably historical, because otherwise it wouldn't be a problem. They would have covered it up. They wouldn't mention it at all. But all the Gospels mention it, so it probably happened. Was Jesus then a disciple of John? We don't know. We don't know precisely Jesus' relationship with John, but he's connected with John. We do know that Jesus was apparently present amongst John's followers, was baptized by John, and then Jesus starts his own ministry, which curiously looks very similar to John's. Because Jesus starts appearing, preaching the repentance, conversion for the forgiveness of sins. And Jesus also seems to start baptizing people. So at some point, Jesus goes out on his own for his own ministry, his own itinerant ministry, walking around Galilee. And then later he shows up in the Roman province of Judea, How long this occurred, we don't know. The traditional dating is it was 3 years. That's if you read the Gospel of John. From certain details in the Gospel of John, it seems to have happened over several years. But who knows? I mean, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you get the impression that everything happened within a year, like really fast. So I would opt for the longer option, but we don't know, and we can't prove it. I can't prove it. I wasn't there with Jesus, so I don't know. So Jesus starts going about Palestine, beginning in his native place of Galilee, preaching and teaching. And in fact, he identifies this as his main purpose. He says, I've come to preach. If you read at Mass on Sunday, this Sunday, they read the Gospel from the Gospel of Mark. I think it was the Gospel of Mark, where it says this, it quotes this. Jesus says to one of his apostles, one of his followers, he says, I have to go into the other towns to preach because that's the reason for which I was sent, to proclaim a message. So that's his primary task, is preaching. But he also works miracles, especially healings. He casts out demons, evil spirits. He reconciles outcasts, those in the peripheries of society. And he acts like a prophet, what Jews expected a prophet to be like. A prophet is a person who speaks on behalf of God. He speaks on behalf of God. And he starts to gain followers, his own followers. He starts to gain followers, especially, interestingly enough, amongst women. Why is this, this is notable because it's noted in the Gospels. It notes the fact that he had a crowd of women who supported his ministry. They gave him money. They helped him out, which was unusual for that time because of, from first century AD, women were not that powerful in society. It was usually men who had control over things. So the fact that Jesus had apparently some women of means who helped him out and gave him the means to continue his ministry is notable, because the Gospels note it, and they actually name some of these women. So we can assume that, for example, readers of the Gospel of Mark, where these women are named, Susanna is one of the ladies named. I think there's another one, Joanna. These names would probably or possibly be known by the readers of Mark's Gospel. They would know who these people were. So Jesus gains followers. It's in Luke's Gospel. I said Mark's Gospel. Luke chapter 8. Verses 1 to 3, if you're curious about that, where Luke described who these women are who support Jesus out of their means. He gains followers according to, we have some description of what kind of men these were. These men he chooses to be his disciples. They're fishermen. Peter, James, and John, these disciples named Peter, James, and John are fishermen. Some of them are politically minded. So we have a follower of Jesus who's called Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were political Jews who wanted to overthrow the Romans and cast them out of Palestine and restore the Jewish kingdom. He had a tax collector named Matthew or Levi, who interestingly enough would have been seen as a collaborator with the Romans, who collected taxes for the Romans on his fellow Jews. So tax collectors were not especially welcomed by many Jews. So Jesus gathers and gains followers. Out of his followers, he chooses 12 men to be his closest followers who would receive his teaching more fully. And this choosing of the number of 12 is interesting because it evokes the idea of the 12 tribes of Israel, these 12 family groups. A tribe is a family group. But the Jews believe that there were 12 family groups that comprised or came from this man. And I mentioned it last time. Jacob Israel, yes? I spoke about Jacob Israel when I was talking about the Messiah, yes? And from Jacob Israel, you get from his children, he has 12 sons, and from each of those sons, you get these family groups that are called the 12 tribes of Israel, of the man Israel. And that's where the Jews descend from. So it's interesting that Jesus specifically chooses 12 men to be his closest followers. It's almost like he's reestablishing the 12 tribes of Israel. There's a symbolism going on there. What that symbolism means, we have to interpret. We have to see what Jesus does with it. Why does Jesus do that? And these men he calls the 12 apostles. And we'll have a class on the apostles later when we talk about the church and the position of the apostles in the church. But I'll tell you right now, Jesus apparently, if you believe the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, Jesus gives them this name apostles, those who are sent out on a mission. So we have their emissaries, in a way, ambassadors, another way to translate this Greek word apostolos. Okay, so they're like the 12 ambassadors of Jesus. Okay, it's the name for these 12 men who are to share in the ministry of Jesus and continue it. So already, it's not Jesus alone. Jesus chooses people to already share in his ministry and to do some of the things he was doing and to preach his message. Because he sends the 12 out on mission to preach his message and to share. He also gives them power to share in his spiritual authority. So the apostles are able to, yes, apostle always makes me smile, Miss Civarelli. Apostle. Anyways, and coffee. Yeah. What was I saying? Back in my notes so I can remember. Oh, yes. He gives them the power that when he sends them out on mission, they can also work miracles too, like Jesus. So it's not just Jesus. Although obviously Jesus is the center and the foundation. Nevertheless, I mean, there's a reason why we have a cross on the wall. I mean, that tells you the end of the story in a way. Well, not truly the end of the story because we have the empty tomb, but I don't know how you would artistically represent the empty tomb. The cross kind of looks cool, you know, it's a good selling point, you know, it's distinctive, you know, it catches your eye, you know. Hangs well from a chain. Right, Mr. Science Book. I don't know how you hang an image of a tomb from a chain around your neck, but anyways. Anywho. But the story goes, you know, it's not all puppy dogs and kittens, you know. The story does kind of sour. And Jesus enters into conflict, into controversy with the Jewish religious leadership and with others. For example, Jesus is accused by religious leaders of breaking the law, the religious law, the norms by which Jews are supposed to live. Jesus, according to them, was a little bit loose on Sabbath observance. You know, on the seventh day of the week, which is a Saturday according to our calendar, Jews are not supposed to, by the law of God and God's command, not supposed to do any kind of work. All right? And that was interpreted with pretty much strictness, okay? Jesus is not so strict about that. Jesus allows some latitude, one could say. So he's accused of breaking the law. His moral behavior is considered scandalous. Jesus is called a glutton and a drunk. You know, he eats too much and he drinks too much. He also hangs out with the wrong people. He is a friend of sinners, prostitutes. He's also a friend, and he hangs out with people who are unclean, like lepers, people who have skin diseases, the untouchables, and traitors, tax collectors. Not just Matthew, but, you know, we have other stories or details in the Gospels where Jesus is accused of being a friend of the tax collectors, who are considered traitors, collaborators with the Romans. Jesus is even accused of being the worst of the worst. He's an agent of the devil, of the evil one. Or, if he's not an agent of the devil, he's possibly possessed by the devil, or he may be even just nuts. You know? Why? Because they have to explain how Jesus can work miracles. If they don't think Jesus is a righteous man, how is he able to perform these supernatural deeds? Well, there's God. There's another supernatural being who's not God, but is also a supernatural being and powerful being, the devil, who maybe is causing Jesus to work miracles. Or as I said, maybe Jesus has been crazy. And even some members of Jesus' family think he's crazy. His mother, Mary, thinks he's nuts. In fact, his family shows up one day because they want to take him away. They want to perform an intervention because they think Jesus has lost his mind from what he's doing. He also does things that are godlike. One example would be that he claims to be able to forgive sins, which he's accused of blasphemy. The word blasphemy is, do I put this on the... I do. I give you a definition here. The word, it's a very specific term. It means that you're showing lack of respect for a god, for anything sacred. It comes from the Greek word blasphemeo, to speak evil about God or sacred things, to show disrespect to sacred things. And Jesus, a man, at least on one occasion, claims to forgive a man's sins. Well, the place to have your sins forgiven was the temple, where you would offer a special sacrifice to God, and God forgave your sins by accepting the sacrifice. But Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't tell the person that he forgives the sins of. He doesn't say, oh, go to the temple and offer the sacrifice. On his own authority, his own power, he says, I forgive your sins. Your sins are forgiven. So that's a problem. For his part, Jesus accused his religious opponents of hypocrisy in their religious observance. What is hypocrisy? Well, it comes from the Greek word hypokrino, which means to play a part or pretend. Posers. He claimed that they were posers. They were all religious on the outside, but they were really evil on the inside. They were insincere. Jesus compares them to tombs that have been painted white on the outside to look beautiful and clean, but inside they're really full of rotten corpses. That's a metaphor he uses to describe some of the religious leaders. He does not deny, this is interesting to note, and maybe even to emphasize, he never denies the religious authorities' authority. He never denies that. In fact, he says that the religious authorities of Israel sit on the chair of Moses. Okay, they have authority to teach the Jews about how to live the law of Moses. He never denies that. However, he says they don't practice what they preach. They make up all these rules and they give all these rulings about how people are to live, but they themselves violate them. They don't practice them. So they're hypocrites. That's something to remember, because people can kind of manipulate the story of Jesus in that way. They'll remember that Jesus called people hypocrites and you're not practicing what you preach, and that somehow that means that whatever the person is saying is invalid. But not necessarily so. Jesus wasn't denying that they were teaching, that they were true teachers of truth. They just weren't following the truth they were supposed to be following. They were teaching it for others and said they had to do it, but they didn't necessarily have to do it themselves. Jesus was concerned that these religious leaders did not care about the spiritual needs or the suffering of the people. So they would emphasize observing the law diligently, but they would lack judgment or mercy or faith. Jesus also faults the religious authorities for not recognizing his superior authority over them. What's that? Oh, is that me? Sorry.
XCN Faith, it's 12:10 p.m.
Oh, thank you. And my anxiety meeting, but I'm so full of anxiety, Miss Thornburg. I forgot to put it on vibrate. Sorry about that. So, I mean, Jesus, and you might have noticed this when you read the Gospel of Mark, Jesus did not have low self-esteem. So Jesus had no self-esteem issues, okay? But, I mean, he thought, he was superior to the religious authorities of his day. And he could teach them, which was interesting. Here's this carpenter from Galilee who's on the low rung of the social pole, on the social ladder, a carpenter, as I told you, not much higher than a beggar, not much higher than a beggar. And he's from Galilee, so he's some kind of redneck country bumpkin. And he's going to tell us, the religious leaders in authority in Jerusalem, that, he's going to tell us how to live Judaism. Who is this guy? So that's what was going on with him. No, I'll get to that. I'll get to Pontius Pilate. We'll talk next time about why Jesus was arrested. This is all going to come to a head, which it does. And I'm sure you know the story, obviously, about Jesus, at least the broad outline. So I'll talk about why there's conflict and how Jesus becomes arrested and then crucified on Thursday. So God bless you all. Good to see you. Stay tuned for news about the quiz. And servant of God, Thea Bowman, pray for us. I've asked to find out if but nobody's world. Do you want copies of my notes? Would that be helpful? Yes. Okay. Just so you know that sometimes I do abbreviations and stuff in my notes, so it might not be always understandable. If you have any questions, just email me. Something doesn't make sense. But hopefully it mostly makes sense. Okay. So let me see what I have for you today. Okay, so here's sources of authority. Okay, this is Jesus' ministry and teaching. I have that twice. Whatever. What is religion? No, that's not for you. This is the introduction to the course. Okay, so that's what I have with me right now.
You have it on a Word document?
I do, yeah. Okay. Would you prefer to have a Word document?
Yeah.
Okay. So just you might want to send me an email just to remind me, because I might forget.
Okay.
But I'll try to remember to send you.
Yeah, I will definitely.
Okay. You're welcome. So take it. Okay, that's it.
I mean, if that's like I said, I just don't want to take your copies.
No, I don't need them anymore.
Oh, you don't?
No. Yeah, no, I don't need them. I've used them,
okay.
And I have them on my computer, so I can just, if I need to print them out again, I can print them out again.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I keep notes on the iPad.
Oh, good. Let me get my thing here. What's going on?
Have a good morning.
You too, miss. Thank you.
You're welcome.